Hello everyone, welcome to today's online event of the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, MECLA. For the first event of the year, we are shining a spotlight on measuring embodied carbon. My name is Hudson Worsley from Precinct, and I have the great pleasure of being the chair of MECLA and welcoming you to today's event. As we begin this event, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and that we are all on Indigenous land. I pay my respect to elders past and present and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Welcome. 2022 was a busy year for MECLA, and 2023 looks even bigger. We now boast over 150 members and continue to build our reach and momentum that is so vitally needed to bring embodied emissions in the construction sector onto a trajectory consistent with the Paris Agreement. We're building industry-wide momentum. There is no question of that. On Tuesday, I represented MECLA at an event here in Sydney, where the New South Wales Infrastructure Minister, Rob Stokes, announced the launch of a decarbonising infrastructure roadmap for New South Wales. He went on to say that infrastructure project success must be measured in terms of time, cost, safety, and carbon. MECLA has been saying this for some time now, and we've also heard it from Infrastructure Partnerships Australia, and now from the New South Wales Government. It's terrific to see industry and government and civil society working together to shape this new definition of success. Now, turning to the inevitable mechanics of this session. We're recording this event, which is a webinar rather than a meeting due to the number of registrations. We've actually had 720 registered attendees, a record for a MECLA event. And carbon accountants out there, you secretly know that this is a fascinating topic, and here's the evidence. So welcome to you all. Please use the Q&A and chat functions for comments and questions. We'll be fielding these during the event. This event qualifies for one CPD point from the Green Building Council for live attendance online. Note, if this does relate to you, please let the MECLA Secretariat know if you haven't already done so when you registered. Also note, you must remain online for at least 50 minutes to qualify for that point, so no gaming the system. As always, I'd like to remind all MECLA members and attendees today of our governance requirements. MECLA does not tolerate any anti-competitive behaviour. We are here in the public interest. We operate in a pre-competitive, pre-competition environment. If you're aware of any conflicts of interest, please speak up and we will adjust accordingly. Many have heard me say MECLA is a do tank. That means we are all about action. We are sharing knowledge across the construction ecosystem to overcome the barriers to the take-up of low-emission materials. Measurement and data can both be a barrier and an enabler, and our working group 2 has been deep in the detail of this. And today, members of that working group are joined by a wonderful panel of speakers to help us explore the dynamic state of embodied carbon measurement. We will hear from neighbours and the Green Building Council, along with those members of the working group who were, and also authors of the discussion paper released last year. We'll hear from each of our speakers and then come together for a panel discussion and to answer questions in the chat. That'll be led by Lucy Marsland, environmental designer at Atelier 10. She'll lead that conversation. Lucy has recently taken on the role of co-chair of our working group on measurement, picking up the baton from Lauren Howe, whose work we all greatly appreciate. Our speakers today include Ivana Brown, Sector Lead, Accelerating Net Zero Buildings at Neighbours. Dijan Ferraro, Manager, Future Focus Rating Tools at the Green Building Council of Australia. Caroline Nola, CEO and founder of the Footprint Company and the other co-chair of Working Group 2. Jackie Bonicia, Manager, Sustainable Futures Integrated Solutions at Lendlease, and George Finas, Engagement Manager at Standards Australia. Quick thank you to you guys for committing and putting the time in to make today's presentations and discussion. Lucy, can I turn to you as our first speaker and to provide an introduction into measuring embodied carbon? What is all the fuss about? Over to you.
Thanks, Hudson. I'm going to lay the foundations of identify some of the key language for the conversation today. So if anyone feels they are a true expert, feel free to pop away for a cup of tea for 3 minutes. Why are we here? This ambition of net zero Australia, net zero organisations, net zero buildings. And when we say net zero, we often mean net zero carbon. But I'll just take a moment now to return to my science background and explain the units of this term. When we say carbon, what do we mean? In this context, carbon represents global warming potential, or GWP, and is measured in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. This means all greenhouse gas emissions associated with an activity, product, or other scope, for example, a building, are converted back to kilograms of carbon dioxide that would result in the equivalent global warming. That aside, we generally look at operational carbon and then embodied carbon. And today we're focusing on embodied carbon, but we acknowledge that LCAs also deal with operational carbon. So what do we mean when we say embodied carbon, building on this language? Here we have our upfront carbon, sometimes spoken as A1 to A5 life cycle stages. We can then see embodied carbon extends to the carbon emissions associated with materials in a building's life cycle. Operational carbon, the resources and emissions associated with the activity within a building. And finally, we can talk about whole of life carbon, considering all emissions associated with a building across its service life. Why do we care? It's all well and good to define these things, but why do we care? Carbon is emitted and greenhouse gases are emitted throughout the life of the building. Importantly associated with the construction phase, which we can see this big blue bar. This is a representative graph, not representative of a particular building, rather the theoretical concepts. Now, the carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gases emitted at the building's construction phase or before construction enter the atmosphere and start impacting global warming today. In comparison, the operational carbon has not yet been emitted and is rather forecasted when we're designing a building. Because of this, it can benefit from future technology as well as the decarbonising grid. So while operational carbon is often seen as contributing a higher proportion of the emissions over a life cycle, once we start to think about the time value of this carbon, embodied carbon really comes to the top of the to-do list, as it would be. How do we measure this carbon? In some ways, it's incredibly simple, and in other ways, it is incredibly complex. Simply put, it is a quantity multiplied by a rate, and that's how we get to that. Those units I discussed earlier. So whether that's tonnage of steel, volume of concrete, kilometres a material has to travel to get from its factory to site, or hours spent in a construction piece of equipment. These quantities are then multiplied by the environmental profile of the activity or product in question. So, historically, we have measured embodied carbon in Australia using life cycle analysis with a reduction from reference case approach, where we establish an alternate design of the building to treat as business as usual reference, and the proposed building emissions are quantified and hopefully demonstrating a reduction from that benchmark. This can be a challenging approach, however, is the generally taken approach to date. An alternative that we can see across the globe, this one's coming out of the UK Institute of Structural Engineers scores grading bands. We can look at an intensity of carbon based on metre squared of GFA and grade projects as they land in this intensity scale. So there's an alternative approach, and what we're going to hear about today is what is being proposed by neighbours for use in Australia to add to this mix. But clear to say, this is a complex space that we are working in with measuring embodied carbon. Finally, why do we care about measuring it? At the end of the day, the measuring is a tool towards improving and optimizing and reducing our embodied carbon. So what can we do? We can use less stuff. It's as simple as that. Job done. The way we can think about this on a building project is to engage early in measuring and identifying and then reducing embodied carbon from day one. At planning, building less, and during design, building clever, building out waste, and specifying materials with strong sustainability certifications. So in this way, we can incrementally reduce our embodied carbon on our projects. Now that's my 3 minutes gone, so I'm going to hand over to our first speaker to take it away, and I believe that's Dijan from GBCA.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Dijan Farao. I'm the technical manager for the future focus rating tools at the GBCA. And I'm here to talk mainly about upfront carbon emissions in Green Star and the calculation guide we have released in partnership with neighbors. Just give me one moment till I share my screen, till I get to share my screen. Apologies, I have 3 screens in front, so just bear with me. So again, I'm here to talk about upfront carbon emissions in Green Star. So a bit of those of you, some of you may in the room may know who we are. So, but for those who aren't aware, the GBCA has been is a not-for-profit organization. We've been here around more than 20 years now, and the main purpose for us is to lead the transformation of the built environment. There are 4 key things we do at the GBCA. We rate, we advocate, we rate through rating tool Green Star. We advocate for better policies. We educate, by holding different seminars and being part of different panels such as these. And we collaborate with the broader industry on how to drive the built environment, a better transformation, and also get consensus and drive consensus. So that's a bit of a snapshot about who we are and what we do. And getting into the I guess the point of discussion today is more around the upfront carbon emissions in Green Star. So Lucy set the context really well, and I'll add a bit more to that. So to set the context, typically when you look at the building's emissions profile, we can see that, whether it's regardless an office building or a single purpose building, your scope 2 or your electricity emissions continue to be the biggest contributor. Then followed by a scope 3, which is your products and materials, which is where we'll be focusing a bit more today. And then followed by your scope 1, which is your gas, refrigerants, and all of the emissions from waste and water. So when we look at that carbon profile over the period of time, we can see that operating emissions continue to be the largest and will continue to be the largest to a big chunk of the pie without any interventions. So that's how, your BAU. However, as we look at a decarbonized grid and we consider all the different net zero commitments in place by different organizations and obligations, we can see that operating emissions at one point, become 0, they flatten. And then the question becomes, what about the other emissions? And that is where the question for us, at least at the time, was, how do we deal with that, or how do we tackle with that? Therefore, in 2017, as for the GBCA, when we worked through the next version of Green Star, this was one of the biggest questions we had. How do we deal with that upfront carbon? Because we know that by 2030, we cannot fix that problem. If you want to fix the problem, we need to start thinking about these things now. So therefore, in 2018, we released the GBCA Climate Positive Roadmap. And within the roadmap, we laid out targets for what the target should be to transform the built environment in the context of upfront carbon. In 2019, we also worked with the World Green Building Council to publish a report called the Bringing Up Embodied Carbon Upfront. And the purpose of the report was to raise to raise awareness on the on upfront carbon and how we can tackle that issue at this point in time. And ultimately, we also looked at global mega trends, and we identified 3 key trends in the transformation of the built environment from a climate science perspective. That was climate action, resource and circularity, and health and well-being. And when we looked at climate action, we saw that buildings accounted for 40% of your energy-related global carbon emissions, out of which 25% were related to building materials and production and construction. And that was mainly from a climate action or a carbon emissions perspective. And when we looked at that from a resource and material perspective, we saw that buildings accounted for 50% of a global material use. That equates to almost 42.4 billion tons of materials consumed annually on a global level. We know that resources are becoming more expensive and they're expected to rise over time. Access to good products are dwindling, and the supply chain is really under the pump, especially with new restrictions from government on pollution and waste across the entire supply chain. So for us, it became really important to focus on emissions, particularly that are happening today as energy systems decarbonize. With all that in mind, when we worked on the next version of Green Star, looking at the climate positive roadmap, which we published, the report with the World GBC, in 2020, we released Green Star Buildings, the next version of Green Star. Green Star Buildings does 5 key things that is really important. The first thing is to deliver new definition of sustainable building. The second, to meet the Paris Agreement, that is mainly a climate positive pathway, which we have in Green Star, and I'll talk a bit more about that. Respond to the sustainable megatrends, as we discussed before the previous slides, and driving opportunities for supply chain transformation. That is mainly targeting at the supply chain, how to drive for low carbon products, and also setting clear expectations for new buildings, which is what we call the minimum expectations. And that's something every building has to meet, regardless whether it's 4, 5, or 6 stars. So when we look at the climate positive pathway, which is the GBCA strategy to help all buildings in Australia to meet the climate positive pathway or the Paris Agreement, there are 5 key things that we ask in Green Star, in the new version of Green Star, which is to be fossil fuel free, that is no gas, powered by renewables, highly efficient, building with lower upfront carbon emissions, and offset with nature. The key focus within that strategy is building with lower upfront carbon emissions. So within the climate positive pathway, which when 6 for a 6 star from 2020, when you first released the rating tool, is a requirement, so that any building is required to have 20% less carbon upfront carbon emissions in the construction of the building. For a 5-star rated building, since from 2023, they are required to have that requirement, and a 4-star rated buildings from 2026 are required to achieve the 20% reduction. Now that's more on a time scale. However, the other key important thing is minimum expectations, the one which is in green. That is, every building under Green Star Buildings is required to achieve a 10% reduction in the carbon emissions. So to put that in context, currently we have 275 buildings that are registered and on track to get a Green Star Buildings rating. So what that means is there are 275 buildings out there looking to reduce the upfront carbon emissions, and the number is just increasing. It's just the beginning. So that's more about what we have in climate positive pathway. The other one is the new definition. So on a broad level, this is what the new different categories, or the new categories as we call them in Green Star, the different credits. The important bit I'd like to highlight are the ones here, the upfront carbon emissions credit, the other carbon emissions, and life cycle impacts credit, which fit within the positive category. So these are the credits which directly speak to upfront carbon emissions and look at reducing what we call as net zero buildings. So a bit more detail on the upfront carbon emissions, upfront carbon credit, and how that works in Green Star. So as we look at the life cycle of a building, we know that, as Lucy mentioned in the previous slide, we have different modules. This is sort of picturized here. In the context of Green Star, this is where we look at it. The upfront carbon emission credit covers, it is module A1 to A5, that's by definition, but within this particular pathway, we look at module A1 to A3. That's more like a simple pathway that we have developed. And what it does is it compares a reference and a proposed building. It only looks, as I mentioned, it only looks at that particular component of a life cycle achievement. And this pathway can be used, what we call minimum expectation credit achievement. And then we have the life cycle impacts credit. The life cycle impacts credit, for those who are familiar or LCA practitioners, is what when we look at the emissions or the whole of life impacts of your building or your project. It does involve complex LCA modeling, looking at different boundaries across different building typologies and what you have. Similar to the upfront carbon credit, we look at the comparison between between the reference and the proposed. So in principle, what we do in Green Star is we look at a proposed building, which is your building, and when we have the reference building, which is how we define it. And I'll speak a bit more about that in the next few slides. So the upfront carbon credit has 3 performance levels. The minimum expectation, as I mentioned, is something that every Green Star building is expected to achieve. That is a 10% reduction. The credit achievement, which is part of the climate positive pathway, which every building will be required to achieve from 2026 onwards, 4, 5, or 6 star, that is a 20% reduction in your upfront carbon and offsetting any other demolition. And then you have something what we call the highest performance level, which is exceptional performance, where we ask for 40% improvement on your upfront carbon reduction, which is, again, it's not mandatory at this point in time, but however, it's an option project teams can choose to pursue should they have any good low carbon reduction strategies within their design. And the way we work in Green Star, we compare your reference design to your proposed, which is typically a Green Star thing, which something we've been doing for a very long time, which is how generally how Green Star works. The upfront carbon credit, which I spoke about, is a very simple calculation methodology which looks at the first 2 performance level, and whereas your life cycle impacts, which is a complex LCA calculators or your models, can be used to show that achieve that 40% reduction. So that's more about the GBCA does in terms of the Green Star does in terms of reducing the upfront carbon emissions. To supplement all this or to complement all the work we've been doing, the GBCA, in partnership with neighbors, have released the upfront carbon emissions calculation guide. Now, for a long time, the industry has been doing life cycle impacts LCA modeling. However, one of the problems that's been there around for a while is how do you define a reference scale? And this is what the guide is trying to do. It helps you calculate upfront carbon emissions. It provides a methodology, your cutoff rules, and guidance on what to infer and what to exclude, and also gives guidance on all different data sources and how to approach that. And it provides a good specification for reference building. And these have been developed talking to different industry, property developers, consultants, and ThinkStep, who was a big thanks to them, who helped us develop this guide with all the technical knowledge. And you'll hear a bit about neighbors, the work they are doing, but similarly, we have consulted with neighbors and kind of understanding how this would work in a way that both the tools complement each other. So the upfront carbon emissions guide is available now and open for feedback. So if anyone's interested, kind of give us some thoughts or deep dive into the details, please feel free to do so. Happy to send out a link to that copy as well. Also, we are currently working on a practical guide to upfront carbon reductions. So this guide will be released in May this year, and which will talk about how you can reduce the different strategies you can implement along the way and whom to talk to from your design, from your handover, from a construction process, including a tender and brief. What are the different stakeholders involved and what to talk to them and how to get their consensus as you work through this. And also the GBC also has their own embodied carbon masterclass, and the next one we have coming up in April. So if anyone has any questions or is interested, please reach out and we'd be happy to share the links. So that's more about us, who we are, what we do, and why we do it, and what next at the GBCA. So thank you.
Thank you, Tijan. I really appreciate hearing the presentation, and we will be dealing with the Q&A at the end of all the presentations. So please keep the questions coming through, and they will be responded to live at the end. So we're next inviting Ivana from Neighbours to present a proposal around the new benchmarking consultation paper. Ivana, I welcome you to share your screen and take over.
Great, thanks. So I think that's sharing now. Yeah, so if you haven't seen or heard from me before, my name's Ivana Brown. I work at Neighbours, and a big chunk of what I do is leading the development of the Neighbours Embodied emissions tool. the embodied emissions tool is a tool much like the tools that we already have to measure, verify, compare the embodied emissions of buildings. We have a consultation paper. It is up on our website at the moment. The consultation is closed, but the paper itself actually outlines a lot of what I'm going to cover today, but also in much more detail what's being proposed and why it's being proposed. So I encourage you to have a look at that if you get a chance, if you haven't already. But in terms of the timeline, yeah, as I said, the consultation paper is out, but the consultation feedback closing date has already happened. And so we are in the process of reviewing all the feedback that we've had, and then we will be publishing final outcomes in the coming weeks. But most of this year will be spent on tool development, including trialing it on pilot projects, and then looking to launch in mid-2024. So that's broadly the sort of timeline that we're looking at. And just a bit of context for the work that we did. We did a significant amount of stakeholder engagement to inform that consultation paper, to understand where the market was at, to understand what the problems are, to test and refine the proposals. You know, we spoke to over 200 people from over 140 organizations. So it was quite a significant amount of stakeholder input in terms of where it's all ended up. So I guess the purpose of today that I wanted to run through with you is just to highlight briefly kind of what stakeholders told us the problem is, what does success look like for a neighbours embodied emissions tool, and what are we proposing? I'll touch on that at the end. So what is the problem? What did stakeholders tell us is a problem around embodied emissions? So the first is that it is an urgent and complex problem. So these are some statistics here from the Green Building Council of Australia, which show that in 2019, embodied emissions was just 16% of total emissions, whereas if you project forward to 2050, that might be as much as 85%. And a lot of the reason for that is the grid is greening, but also buildings are becoming more efficient. So the proportion of emissions coming from embodied emissions is growing. So it's a real problem, it's urgent. And the other thing that we heard from stakeholders is that the industry is highly fragmented. So that makes comparisons between buildings problematic. So what does fragmented mean? It means that everyone who's measuring it is kind of measuring it in their own way. They're using different data sets. They're using different parts of the building. They're using different reference cases. They're comparing it to different things. And so the results that you get at the end of it are effectively incomparable. And it's the comparison between buildings that has driven a lot of change in the property sector. And lastly is that there is varied understanding, and it is complex and costly to measure. So even on this call, we will have a huge array of kind of understanding around embodied emissions. And if you're kind of going through this like in this spotlight event, kind of going, oh, I'm struggling to follow on with what's happening, you're probably not alone, because a lot of the industry is kind of at the very early stages of their understanding. And Green Building Council of Australia is doing some amazing work in terms of putting out some guidance to help lift that understanding. So I definitely encourage you to have a look at some of those as they come out. But also everyone who's measuring embodied emissions, not everybody is doing it, but those that are putting in a lot of effort to work out how to measure. And that's time and effort and resources taken away from working out how to improve. So stakeholders told us that they really wanted to see a consistent approach, and they really had a very strong desire for neighbours to develop an embodied emissions tool, something that would create kind of a national approach for calculating embodied emissions. And we have worked really closely with the Green Building Council of Australia on this. And one of the questions we always get is, how will this be different? Will the two integrate? Will it be two different things? And part of the reason of collaborating so closely with the GBCA is to make sure that it isn't two separate things, that they are aligned, and that you don't have to do two separate rating tools, that neighbours will become a pathway under GBCA, under its rating tools. So what does success look like in developing a tool? Like, what are we really aiming towards when we're designing this? So we have 3 main objectives. This is what Neighbours wants to achieve out of it. And the first one is to urgently reduce embodied emissions. And we want to be influencing the design, construction, and procurement process. So all of those elements are kind of part of what we want to see behaviour change in. Focusing primarily on measurement, verification, benchmarking, and disclosure, which is kind of aligned to the way that Neighbours ratings tools work, and start by solving targeted problems now rather than waiting to solve all problems in embodied carbon. So you'll see what's in the proposals. It's quite a pared back approach, and we have created a roadmap that kind of shows how we plan to expand that over time. We also asked our stakeholders what their needs are. So what this is, and we developed these market needs. There's 6 of them. I won't go through them in detail, but this is just to say that these market needs are essentially what the tool must address in order to be successful and in order to be adopted by them. And so those objectives and these market needs essentially became our decision-making framework for how we have landed on the proposals that we have. So what are we proposing? We have 10 proposals in our consultation paper. They broadly address kind of these areas, which is the scope of the tool, what's in and what's out, the calculation method, like what data is being used and how the data is being reported, the benchmarking, so how the comparison will work, what the certification process looks like, and also that roadmap for how we plan to expand the scope of the tool over time. I'm not going to cover 10 proposals here because we're a little short on time. I'm just going to pick a couple that I think might be worthwhile to touch on now. And there's more, and if you want to look at all of them, you can have a look at them in the consultation paper. So the first one is under tool scope, is that we are proposing to have the tool only be applicable to new buildings and major refurbishments. So it's not for minor refurbishments or renovations, and it's not for existing buildings. It's really looking at new buildings and major refurbishments. The second proposal is that we are looking at upfront emissions only. So I think Lucy kind of mentioned this at the beginning. It's A1 to A5 if you're familiar with that terminology, but I think in more practical terms, it means that everything up until the point at which the building is constructed or practical completion. So it includes all the construction stuff, includes all the transport of the materials to site, and it includes all of the materials, all the emissions associated with the materials that go into the building. We have flagged this one in our roadmap. When you see this sign, that means we flagged it in our roadmap that we have started with something smaller and simpler and are going to look at how to expand that over time. So that means that the use stage isn't included. So maintenance, repairs, refurbishments, and end of life isn't included either. Cold shell is the default building scope. So that means when we are looking at comparing your embodied emissions, we'll be looking at the emissions of the cold shell. What does cold shell mean? It is kind of the structure and the facade and your base building kind of services. So it doesn't include your carpets, your internal walls. It doesn't include your HVAC in the floor plate itself, no lighting, plumbing, ceilings, floor finishes, that sort of thing. And actually 80% of emissions come from your cold shell when you're looking at upfront emissions. So this is another way in which we have tried to focus on where we can have the biggest impact in a slightly simplified version. And again, one that we have flagged as to be reviewed in future. The calculation method, so skipping a few into the calculation method. So this really looks at what sort of data we are proposing to be used within the tool. So Neighbours will encourage verified product-specific emissions data and will apply conservative defaults when no emissions data is available. So when you get a material like a timber or a concrete, we're proposing that the emissions for that is from something like an EPD, so an environmental product disclosure statement. An environmental product disclosure statement essentially is done by international standard. It's third-party verified, and it outlines the emissions associated with that product. Another option is the climate active product disclosure statement. So you might have a carbon neutral certified product through climate active, and you would get a climate active product disclosure statement with that, and that would list what your emissions are. But we recognize that not all products, materials have these, and so we will provide a table of emissions factors that you can use where you don't have them. And we are proposing that they will be set in a conservative way. The rationale around that is that product manufacturers would generally be better off verifying their product's carbon footprint, so measuring and disclosing that, rather than using what's in the table of emissions factors. So it's meant to kind of generate that behavior change as well. And we are rewarding reuse, but because reused materials are entered into the calculator as 0 embodied emissions, plus emissions generated in repurposing for reuse. Benchmarking. So benchmarking is the mechanism through which we create comparisons between buildings. And at a very high level, we're kind of proposing to follow a similar methodology to what we currently use in our existing neighbours tools. So we would have a star rating system, and that star rating system is determined through a statistical analysis of data from existing buildings. So in like Neighbours Energy, we look at metered data, but here we might use something like bills of quantities to get material quantities. And then this creates kind of whole of building benchmarks. So it means that every project can set whatever target they want, whether that's 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. And it means that each project team can decide what strategies they use to achieve that. So whether that's the design, the construction, or the procurement practices, they can kind of employ one or all of those. And yeah, this might be something that needs to be reviewed in future as well, as more data becomes available, as those benchmarks change. The certification process, I guess kind of the main thing here is just to say that certification would be following practical completion. Once the design, the construction and the procurement has all happened and we have certainty around what's in the building, that's when you would be able to get your certification. And it would go through our verifications processes where we would audit the ratings that come through. There are some options to review progress along the way. So potentially you could go through an independent design review, or we have all of our tools available online. And so you'd be able to use those throughout the project as well. And future development. So I flagged a couple of times here where we have started with a more pared back scope and flagged that something might expand or change over time. So that's all articulated in our roadmap. And part of the rationale for that is really to signal to the market where it's going. Sometimes some of the reasons why we have started with something simpler is simply because data is not available, or industry is not quite ready to respond. And so by putting this in the roadmap, we can start to send the signal to industry to get ready and respond to that over time. If you would like more information about anything that I've covered today, it's all in the consultation paper, so I encourage you to go and have a look at that. It's on our website. And you can also get in touch with us at neighbours@environment.newsouthwales.gov.au if you have further questions. And all that information is on our website, so you can go and have a look there.
Thank you so much, Ivana. Again, questions will be answered after we've completed the presentation, so keep them coming. We appreciate everyone's thoughts. We're now handing over to the MECLA Working Group 2 chapter authors, at least 3 of them, which is George, Jackie and Caroline. I'll pass over to you guys.
Thanks, Lucy. I think George is going to go first. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline, and afternoon, everyone. So as part of the MECLA Working Group 2 discussion paper, there was an extensive scan to identify and map standards related to embodied carbon and also broader environmental sustainability. These included traditional standards, so standards such as ISO standards, European standards, but also looking at things like publicly available specifications as done by BSI, the British Standards Institute over in the UK, but also other industry standards such as the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors whole life carbon assessment for the built environment. So those types of standards and publications as well. These standards were then considered and grouped according to their different scale and type. So the 3 scales we identified were the product scale. So these were standards which provided requirements and guidance for quantifying and communicating the footprint of a product or material. The second scale was then building, which looked at assessing the footprint of a building and infrastructure. And then the third was the infrastructure, which looked at assessing infrastructure projects such as road, rail, dams, ports, and so on. The other 2 types of standards were carbon accounting standards and standards that related to broader environmental accounting or measurement. So through this exercise, through the actual mapping, the 2 assessments we carried out were whether the standard was a single or multi-impact indicator standard. So was it carbon accounting or was it full life cycle assessment of broader environmental impact categories, or whether the standard just applied to one, be it material, building, or infrastructure. And then those standards were mapped, and they're found on the discussion paper in section 2. So the findings were that overall, I think the mapping was helpful in the sense that it gave us a broad view of where the world is at with embodied carbon standards and accounting. I think one theme we've heard today is that naturally this landscape is fragmented in the sense that we are looking at things in different ways, and many standards we found touched on broad environmental impacts and ESGs rather than purely embodied carbon. And then when we took the working group 2 paper out to a survey, we've also found some quite interesting results there, where we found a lot of members found there was a real need for clarity and alignment so that the whole of industry is working together on embodied carbon. It was clear that things like EPDs to standards like ISO 1444 and 1440 are good. They're, I guess, established solutions that cover sort of broad environmental management and ESG requirements. But we also received a lot of responses where we saw a willingness, unsurprisingly, I guess, for a specific standard or a tool on embodied carbon that was specific to measurement, reporting, and verification processes of embodied carbon and not of ESGs. And I think, unsurprisingly, as we move towards net zero and buildings are running on renewable energy, embodied carbon will be the big thing to measure, and Australia will need to have the right tools to measure this. So the standards mapping was just one way of, I guess, having that global or that macro view of what the world is doing and where we're up to with standards of documents on embodied carbon accounting, and also sort of ESG reporting and sort of broader environmental impacts as well. So thanks. I'll hand over to
me. Thank
Caroline.
you. Thanks, George. Thanks. I should have probably actually jumped in at first and sort of after Lucy did, and sort of thank again all of the participants of Task Group 2. This group is one of the larger ones across the MECLA group, and it's been quite a long complex process, just even trying to chunk things down. As you heard from George talking about, he led the standards. We broke up this task into 4 distinct work groups to try and help clarify things, because anytime you get into a room, everybody started talking about everything and we weren't getting anywhere. So we've sort of got 4 streams. Jackie's going to talk after me about sort of the materials stream specifically. But I just wanted to sort of thank everybody who participated. And I also wanted to just quickly say, as a career quantity surveyor, being in the industry for more years than I really care to think about. And about 25 years ago, when I started actually even doing embodied carbon measurement of buildings, I was sort of hopeful that maybe I could influence 1 or 2 more people. So even just sitting here today, being with you all, with the hundreds of people who are on here, the influence of MECLA, the fact that we have neighbours here now as a benchmark, hopefully in the future becoming sort of whole of industry type of benchmark. It blows my mind that for 20 years it's been a pretty lonely place for many of you who are on here, who are also long experts at doing this. So it's just an awesome thing to be here today. In terms of just, obviously, we've all sort of said the paper that we've developed and have published, it's certainly shone the light on the complexity. As a person in this area, we've obviously appreciated that level of complexity for a very long period of time. And also, I think what's really highlighted in this paper is just the variety of knowledge needs across all the different actors in the industry. Those from the procurement at the construction level all the way to an investor. The needs of the industry in terms of how they act and what information and the tools they have are actually clearly very varied. So I think from this group, there's certainly a huge amount of opportunity for us to continue to progress to assist all those different parts of the industry. I think I'd like to just quickly labour the point that this paper really tried to spend a lot of time distinguishing between the needs and calculations of individual products, a brick, a building, a whole building, including its tenancy, base building, warm shell, and everything else, and a piece of infrastructure in its totality. And that the needs of and the context for measuring these sorts of things are actually very different. And so it's really important for us to appreciate that with our shared vision of rapidly decarbonising the entire industry, that we sort of really do move forward to understand that entire range of impact in order for us to be able to understand sort of where we're acting and the influence and exactly how fast we need to be acting in order to be getting to a place. Jackie's going to touch on sort of some of that in terms of just, what does define low embodied carbon from a materials perspective. Our group is also comprised an incredible cross-section of all industry players. And so it does also it has also become clear, and even just sort of formulating this paper that we've published, that it also brings to, sharp relief that the measurement methods, depending on where you are in this supply chain of the building, obviously can vary. Our paper outlines the benefits of the bottom-up process type of approach and how important that is to individual materials and helpful that is, but it's not necessarily helpful to us at that planning scale or the whole building scale, certainly in the early stages of conceptualising investment in building assets. The top-down methodology, which is sort of well enshrined in the RICS, PAS, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and in policy, is certainly very helpful for us at these more broad scales, but not helpful really at that individual brick product level. So it's really looking at, how do we utilise the benefits and strengths of all of those available methods along the supply chain and delivery, and make sure that we have some practical ways of moving that forward. I think it's encouraging to see that RICS, the PAS 2080 amongst others, and the greenhouse gas have recognised the need to sort of make a combined type of methodology so that we can ensure that services related inputs into achieving our whole building and infrastructure outcomes cover that 95% of the cost of a building or piece of infrastructure in a way that ensures that we understand the full scope of it at that point, so that key decisions can be made to ensure that we're tackling as much of this as possible. I think it's also a crucial point in terms of the question of exactly what level of intensity a whole building or infrastructure has and what defines what is necessary at this point in time. Obviously, many are just going, and obviously the Neighbours platform seeks to tackle a starting point, which is really sensible because we can't run until we walk, and having sort of some focus on that is terrific. But I still feel like, what defines good? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Should it be half? Should it be zero? We don't know. And it's a key area, I think, that we would continue to discuss in terms of that context to Paris. The GBCA have obviously in their process, in their new tool, have defined a starting point in terms of a 10, a 20 and a 40% step. And so it would be good to see how does this play out, and in terms of sort of exactly what we need. And certainly in terms of the GBCA tool and Neighbours, they are addressing a certain sector of the economy, and one of the parts of our paper was also infrastructure. And we're certainly sort of seeing that, when you look at all the parts of the industry that aren't necessarily covered by these two tools, it's still leaves us with a basis on which MECLA obviously is going to keep focused on progressing. Again, it's sort of incredibly interesting to highlight the complexity, and that I think that this group is still in a very good position for us to be able to pursue all of these areas of industry interconnectedness process, and to support the future inclusion of all of these things, so that we are tackling that big MECLA mission, which is really about the transformation of the industry towards that, net zero, if that's where we're going. So I think I'd like to hand over to Jackie now to sort of perhaps, I've discussed sort of those broader issues of the whole paper, plus also coming down to the measurement of the building itself. But I feel like Jackie's paper on the how do we actually define a benchmark for material and what does that look like? Jackie, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, and thank you for all of that context. As Carolyn said, the chapter that I contributed most to was really focused just at the material level, so I was just going to talk to that today. Alexi's posted a link to the whole paper, so I'm not going to go through all of the detail. It's out there for anyone who wants to see it, but within the functional units / declared units section, we propose a number of different divisions or categories of materials that we could look at, and how you would define that material unit to get a common element of comparison between different products from different suppliers. We also then took that through to look at what you would do to try to establish a benchmark for each of those material groups. And we looked at a couple of different potential methods. Two of those were based on process data. One of them was based on a combination of all lifecycle inventory data, and then there were two that were sort of more qualitative, that were there as, I guess, exploratory ideas. And the paper also worked through a couple of different examples from both concrete and steel to show how those different methods would lead to different benchmarks for each of those material categories. It also looked at what the influence of geography on that benchmarking process, and took steel reinforcement as an example to show how that influenced the benchmarking results. It covered some examples from overseas of what's happening around benchmarking materials in this space. And I'm sure everyone's aware it's a really quickly evolving space since the paper was published at the end of last year. There's also been a new benchmarking method put out under the Inflation Reduction Act over in the USA. So for anyone who's interested in that, that's a new contribution to the benchmarking process at a material level. And I just wanted to talk really quickly to the feedback that came back on the discussion paper. So this is at a high level. Of course, everyone agrees that benchmarking would be a highly useful thing to have at a material level. And the role that MECLA would have in that would probably be research, discussion, pulling ideas together, rather than necessarily defining those benchmarks. That was probably some of the feedback that came back. There was a strong preference at the material level, as Carolyn said, for process-based data, that bottom-up lifecycle assessment and lifecycle inventory data. And there was also some preference for alignment with global approaches to the extent that we can. Obviously, Australia's a very specific market, but a lot of the products that we're using in our buildings work at a global scale. And so ideally, to the extent possible, aligning with standards and processes for benchmarking that are happening overseas. So they were the main points I wanted to cover from the materials section. I'm not sure whether I'm passing back to someone else in Carolyn.
Yeah, I'll sort of summarise the obviously the last part of the chapter, last part of the paper. Thank you so much, Jackie. Well put for a very complex section of the paper. The last section, we did try and pull together a variety of sources of information where sort of some of these original pieces of data live in various inventories, as well as a variety of calculation tools. As Jackie said, it's a very active space. As I said, 20 years, nobody cared, and now everybody's into it. So it's interesting to see the extent of these tools and calculators and so on. So I think it also is sort of like further work in terms of sort of like just trying to bring some synthesis around the use of all of those, or where does information live? We've all been having, conversations about national inventories. Is that something that should be of the future? And if so, how would that be achieved in terms of sort of, just the cost to the community of achieving something in that order? The paper is available. Thank you so much for us being able to have the opportunity to communicate sort of some of the key chapters. There's certainly extensive feedback on the paper, and hopefully that it's sort of clear from this sort of session that you can sort of see how what we've done and MECLA's ongoing role sort of has also put in the context of where the neighbours team are working and where GBCA is working, and that obviously we hope for a really strong collaboration into the future, so that we can achieve the broad MECLA objectives and all our honestly shared vision of a safe and planet where we can all live well together. Lucy, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you, Jackie and George, for sharing your insights and some of the detail that you guys have been through in the last period of time. So we're moving over to the Q&A portion of this session. And so I'll ask Dijan and Ivana to video back up so we can see your smiling faces, and we'll crack into some of the many questions coming through. I appreciate the conversation between the audience as well. It's really great to just see that sharing of knowledge in this industry. It's always good to see. We'll start off with sort of a technical question around this defining of scope, and I wanted to look to Ivana to hear a little bit more about how the A4 and A5 phases of upfront carbon can be measured for the neighbours tool, both in the case where there is sort of clear data for a project, and then in the scenario where there may not be record of data.
I guess at a high level, I would say that what we have put together in our consultation paper is really high level. Like, it's 10 very foundational principles. And so there's going to be a lot of technical questions that need to be resolved during tool development. And so we don't have answers to those at this point in time yet, just lots of options that need to be considered. But I guess, we have heard a lot of feedback in our consultation process around what are some opportunities and risks that we do need to consider in tool development, and that has been really helpful. So I guess I would just say at high level, we haven't really resolved that yet. Yeah.
No, that's no worries. And I know there was also some questions around, I think demolition was dealt with in the response that you gave to those that were asking around how we deal with demolition, and that is that the reuse of materials get treated as having zero emissions, so that projects do benefit and are motivated to reuse, which is high in the hierarchy of sort of actions to take. There was also a question asking around the A0 or the pre-construction life cycle phase, which I can probably quickly answer, that the focus is on those hotspots or those really large contributors to a building project's emissions, and for that reason the A0 is not treated at this time. I wanted to ask a question to Dijan around how Green Star has found uptake of these new tools, getting involved into these complex spaces, and how both neighbours and Green Star try to balance technical accuracy, precision, and account and quantification, how we balance that with giving access and providing uptake to as many people and as many projects as possible. Either of you want to take that on?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that on, Lucy. I guess in the context of Green Star, there has been uptake. So as I mentioned earlier, there have been 275 projects that are registered for Green Star buildings. So what that means is, and that's just the beginning. And there are other projects which are going for 20 and some even going for 40%. So it is, the evidence is there for us to show that there is a big uptake. Yes, there are challenges, especially for someone who's new to this space trying to figure out how do we hit that 20%, right? And we are having those conversations with those developers, depending the different typologies they are dealing with. So although there hasn't been like an immediate solution, but what we are seeing is there is a lot of engagement and collaboration happening due to these requirements, particularly, right? Because everybody's trying to push it one way or the other. There are different avenues that anyone can pursue, so we are not very explicit that you have to do X, Y, and Z as long as you meet the 10% reduction. And I think to answer your question around that accuracy, at this point, it is dependent on a few accurate, like EPD, accuracy-based evidence, such as EPDs, whereas in an event where there's no clear evidence, we do allow assumptions. And we have been allowing for a while, right? Even through the LCA modeling, etc. So at this point in time, I think, as you mentioned earlier, the focus is on the hotspots, how to get that down. And over the period of time, as we get more information, I think accuracy and everything else that is important will just, for the purpose of accuracy, will fall in place.
Lovely.
So, yeah.
Stefano, was there anything you wanted to add for neighbours in terms of how to encourage more access and more uptake to more projects?
Yeah, it is definitely front of mind for us. It is one of the, I guess, the market needs that was identified, that it needs to be streamlined, it needs to be cost effective. And that was not just from customers, like people who would actually be customers of neighbours, but that also came from, policymakers as well. Like if they were going to start specifying this in different ways, like they needed to see that it could be done in a cost-effective way. Yeah, so that is definitely part of our decision making in terms of how we design the tool, and there are definite tensions between, because trust is another one of the market needs. People need to have trust in the results. And so there is a tension between those that we need to find a good balance for. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you for that. Zooming out a bit, and I wanted to ask Jackie, because you mentioned the US more recent regulation updates, and I don't expect you to get into lots of detail, but I wonder if you could share a little bit with the group around some of these global regulations and updates at the policy scale coming in, and then whether for the rest of the panel there are any opinions on sort of how industry is influencing policy and how these tools may come to play at a governance level.
Sure, I'm happy to start, but I won't pretend to be an expert on US policy and regulation. As I understand it, the Inflation Reduction Act has put some requirements in around lower embodied carbon materials being used within government projects. And of course, one of the key issues that you have there is then defining what lower embodied carbon means, which was indeed, a lot of our challenge as well. The proposed approach, and I understand that there might still be a period of consultation or feedback going on, is that they will use data that has been aggregated through a database called EC3, which is a embodied carbon database basically put together by digitizing EPDs, really at its core. But the great thing about that is it pulls together live EPD data in one place and categorizes that and then places it on a scale where you can see performance of specific products against benchmarks. I understand it's setting specific thresholds. I think it said that, I'm not going to say actually, in case I get it wrong. Everyone should read the paper. I have 20% in my head, but
it is, Jackie, it is 20%. Interestingly, they're applying a plus and minus 10% to that 20%, which I think really talks to accuracy of product declarations, which,
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the EC3 database itself also has a 20% uncertainty factor inside the database built in around uncertainty within EPDs. So there obviously is some efforts there to try and give you bands of performance, but it's interesting because I guess it's a defining lower embodied carbon materials at a countrywide scale for what I think I understand is the first time at a policy level. I'm not sure that I've maybe in one of the smaller Nordics, and I'm not aware of it, but I haven't seen it done across multiple different categories at that scale, I don't think. So yeah, an interesting one from that perspective. I guess other ones we referenced within the paper, the Carbon Leadership Forum has that's sort of precursors to that Inflation Reduction Act work. We also reference CIBSI and iStructi for their work setting material level approaches and benchmarks for embodied carbon.
Thanks, Jackie.
Yes, I think it is definitely a key question that needs to be answered both at that material level, but also then at the building and the infrastructure scale. Because just because you have a carbon footprint product declaration or whatever doesn't make you better or worse. It's about sort of then, what's that definition and what does that need to look like? And I guess Varna articulated that when they're in a position to be able to actually presumably define a star for the neighbours, then that'll have, similarly to the operating carbon, you're going to have a band because it's not going to be an absolute number because it takes account of this various layers of accuracy and completeness. So it is a question I have in terms of sort of some of the accuracy levels that background auditing, it's 2% accurate or it's 3% accurate. I think that sort of some of those things perhaps want to be thought through as you go forward, given the inherent layers of inaccuracy that gets baked in at all sorts of different levels at this point in time.
Thanks all for that one. I wanted to hear if anyone has an opinion on would like to share some thoughts on the role of, we're talking about measuring and how that gets used, sharing, declaring these benchmarks, and then looking to balance that with education. I guess, Ivana, it's a question to you. Does neighbours envision that their embodied carbon benchmark how that will play a role for buildings and businesses but through sharing those benchmark ratings?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely a need for capacity building in the industry broadly. I think that neighbours and having a tool around which to measure and compare will play a role in that. But I guess I would say that probably a bigger role is the role of the Green Building Council of Australia, who, generally do provide quite a lot of capacity building to industry around new and emerging topics. So yeah, they're already doing quite a lot of work around embodied emissions to build capacity, and yeah, the calculation guide, which I think is out already, and then the Upfront guide, which is coming out soon, which is going to be a really great introduction. So I highly recommend that people have a look at that if they're kind of new to the space. Yeah, a really great kind of starting point. Dijon, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that capacity building, we did recognize that it's not just enough if we put out the rating tool. It's really about setting up the mechanisms for the industry to start implementing that. So that's why I think last year we released the practical guide to electrification, because we knew that we had to remove gas. We set the requirement. So the next step we did was release a practical guide. And that's the reason we're releasing the practical guide to upfront carbon in May, but also the guide as well, as Ivana mentioned, because that was really about capacity building. Even though the industry knows how to do that stuff for the last 8-9 years or more than that, or probably much more than that, but that capacity building has those guides and practical guides has been a big important factor for us. The other bit I would say is capacity building. Something the industries we are seeing happening is it's unlocking opportunities in the green finance space slowly. I think that is a big capacity building, which I think is a big driver in terms of pushing not just embodied carbon, but quite a few things. So yeah, so there is quite a bit happening out there. I think we'll see that over the course of this year and next year, what that looks like.
And Dijon, while we've got you, tell me if you can't answer this, but I think maybe you can. There've been a couple of questions around the links between these tools and Climate Active. And I have this idea that you can get the Climate Active certification through Green Star for embodied carbon. Could you just speak briefly to that?
Yeah. So we worked with Climate Active last year to release, and with neighbors as well, neighbors, GBC and Climate Active, we worked together to release the Climate Active Upfront Carbon Guideline. And currently, the way it's been set up in a way that for at least the Green Star, you can achieve that for the Green Star buildings by achieving the climate positive credits. So it is quite well aligned with what we have in terms of the climate positive pathway. So that's how it's been set up. Even other tools, when I say other tools, the other legacy tools can also apply for it, but we have different set of requirements. So yeah, I mean, we have had a few projects, at least one project that went through the process and got certified, which was end of last year. I think it was Believe GPT. It's publicly available. It's publicly known knowledge. And eventually, as when neighbors works through their guide as well, I'm certain that even that will be added as a pathway within that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is planned to be a pathway. And I will just clarify as well that that is for upfront emissions, carbon, not for the product side of things, which is different. So Neighbours doesn't do any product certifications. We will be deferring to existing mechanisms for that. We won't be doing any ourselves. Yep.
No, thank you. And if anyone on the call doesn't know, Climate Active is the federal government initiative to certify products, organisations, events, services, and buildings as carbon neutral. So providing those offsets, and it does seem like there it's almost a bit of a sandwich of you can have climate active products and you can have a climate active embodied upfront embodied certification with the measurement in the middle, which is a little bit complex, but we get there. Now, I guess probably getting close to some of our final questions, I'd be keen to hear from everyone on the call, coming from each of your different spaces, what people who are here today can do to contribute to this work, these tools coming out, and the embodied carbon space more broadly. A bit of a, if you want to take a moment to give a call to action or share what work you are doing personally in your professional space, we might go around the whole panel to hear some of those thoughts. I'll look first to George.
Thanks, Lucy. I think there was a really interesting point around simplification, and I think it might have been misinterpreted because standards are often not the things you want to simplify, or often the things you can't simplify. But I think if there is a call to action, I think we all need to be singing from the same song sheet, which I think we're doing. I think we have realised that embodied carbon is the thing we're meant to be focusing on, especially since we are transitioning to net zero. I just think there will need to be that clarity, and I think as we operate in this space more and more, I think we will start to see that clarity, especially as everyone gets on board. I'm not sure what my call to arms would be. I think it would just be to hang in there. And I think that there is really, from what we've seen in MECLA and in our working group, there is real momentum, I think, to take this to the next level.
Thanks, George. Caroline, do you want to give some thoughts to this point?
Oh, it's just, it's an open slather, isn't it, really? If I was to pick one thing, I feel like it's probably incumbent on all of us who operate in the built environment space to really try and look for utilising information in a way that either ensures that we understand what is our maximum impact at any point in that life cycle of an asset. I feel like there's still a lot for us to evolve to, and it's certainly an area that we operate a lot in, which is bringing the carbon in the building to the user of that information, which is core foundation to ISO. And in that, I mean, how do we connect design to its impact? So not seeing necessarily just a pile of concrete, a pile of steel, a pile of something. That tells us one thing, but it doesn't really help designers at that early stage, because in all the experience many of us have had here, half of the carbon footprint of an entire building or infrastructure piece is decided in the first few weeks of making a decision for that piece of physical asset. And so we need to understand the relationships and the design directions and the relationship to outcome. And that early action is crucial. So waiting until we have enough EPDs in the world and all that sort of stuff so we can count individually all those pieces, that's crucial as a foundation that we eventually move towards. But in the meantime, how do we really help the decision makers, the governments, make the policy for here's how much embodied carbon we don't want, and the investors and the owners and so on, to connect their decisions to an outcome. And to me, that's really the important space that we somehow have to continue to move on whilst these foundations of product carbon footprinting and NABERS and Green Star and ISCA and all the other tools are sort of moving towards. And I just sort of say we can't forget that early space, because that's the bit where we take the biggest no-cost actions and transform today, and not waiting for another 5 years. In another 5 years, we're sort of missed the boat on another 10 years worth of carbon investment. So I'd say that. And the other thing I will actually say is we need to actually start really focusing on that upfront carbon, the acceleration of upfront carbon through the progression of zero carbon operations, because that's also been highlighted in recent global research to say this is now a problem we have to be worried about.
Thanks, Caroline. Over to Jackie.
Thanks, Lucy. And I think I build on what Caroline said, because it's got so many people that need to be involved, and that's, the purpose of MECLA. Everyone with a role to play. Early design is as Caroline said, really important. But I think if it was like one call to action for everybody that we can all get behind, I personally think that we should be advocating really hard for policy in this area. And obviously the work that NABERS is doing is a really big part of that, and will underpin a lot of activity in the area. And I think that's really exciting. But I think from whatever angle you're coming at this problem, you need to be advocating to the government that we're ready to step up and take action, and we need to do this. We know so much of our carbon emissions are embedded in our products, and increasingly more so as we decarbonise the grid. So we need clear and decisive action and signals from the government around the pathway of reduction moving forward, and we need to signal to government from our perspective that we're ready for that, I think.
Thanks, Jackie. I think you've captured a lot of key things and set these two up from the benchmarking position to say anything. Maybe Dejan first that you would like to say, whether it's in response or looking forward and speaking to those here today on what they can go home and do. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Lucy. I think my call of action, like if I had to say, it would be kind of in alignment with by Caroline, Jackie, and George. I think if I had to put it in one sentence, I would say it's a coordinated effort, and it starts from all the way from early design thinking, at least from a building level, right? So when we start pushing those manufacturers or the suppliers for a good product, that's where it starts, because that's the challenge we are hearing about, like that they cannot find good products. So from our perspective, at least, it starts at that level, from an early design and procurement stage. Like when you start asking for this, the manufacturers may not have it, and that's fine. But the more you ask for it, they will eventually find out a way or figure out a way to give it to you. So yeah, it is starting with us, and we start from a policy, advocacy, and a collaborative space.
Thank you so much. And Ivana, you've got the last points to make.
Yeah, I guess the last point I'll make is just how important it is that we kind of move forward together. One of the reasons why the commercial building sector in Australia is a world leading one is because of that, because we are moving together in the same direction. And so I think it's really important, and it's on all of us to kind of facilitate that rather than fragmenting. So I guess that would be my call to action to everybody is, you know, let's find a way to do that.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad you guys all kind of came to it. Had some really strong themes out of that last spontaneous putting you on the spot with some big thoughts moment. And it comes back to what I imagine in the graph that I showed with the sort of bumps down the design path of early and integrated design actions have the, as Carolyn says, the lowest cost often. You know, the no cost or low cost decisions happen early, and they can only happen with everyone on board. So I think we're seeing, you know, we're seeing the quantity surveyors, we're seeing the architects, we're seeing all the services engineers, as well as the structural engineers and everyone else in the design team coming on board and getting involved in embodied carbon. And anyone on the call today who feels like embodied carbon isn't relevant to them, hopefully they walk away understanding that we all have a role to play to own our carbon. And one of my colleagues said to a group the other day, if you're a Joe Blogg lawyer walking down the street, your emissions are associated with your lifestyle. And those of us in the built environment doing buildings or infrastructure, it is what our personal emissions might be, driving our car or riding our bike, are dwarfed by the projects that we work on. So that is a scary but also powerful thing to think about in terms of our impact that's possible. So I'm going to pass over to Hudson to close us out and let us know what we can look forward to on the MECLA horizon.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to our panelists. This is fantastic. And look, I reckon the point about collaboration and bringing the industry, we know that change isn't linear. We know that it always takes so long to get started, and then suddenly things fall into place. Now, yes, the lead times on the pieces of infrastructure and the buildings that we're talking about, Caroline makes a great point about, you know, starting now, because the decisions that we make in early project conception lock in or lock out carbon of what will be built for the next 10 years. So that is vital. To that point, coming back to the announcement from Minister Stokes in the New South Wales government on Tuesday, part of the roadmap that he mentioned is a change to the business case discount rate applied to New South Wales infrastructure projects, moving from 7% to 5%. He then called out it really should be 0%. That may be a politician who's about to exit politics and feels the freedom and candor that comes with not having to hang around forever. But the point being, if you're going to build something for the very long term, like intergenerational assets, for instance, the Harbour Bridge, then you need to be thinking very, very long term, and a discount rate that only validates something for 20 years is simply not good enough. And so factoring the full life cycle costs of our buildings, of our assets, has to be part of that. So Jackie, your point about policy, I think is spot on. George, flying the standards flag, thank you. That is terrific. Having the Green Building Council here, and I've contributed to some of the masterclasses, that's the capacity building that is so important to getting this non-linear change underway. And then, Ivana, you didn't have to answer it, but someone also commented that the UK is importing our neighbours program over there. That's a real feather in the cap for the neighbours team. But that's influence of a recognised tool. So thank you very much to our speakers. It's a great example of the collaboration and honesty that we don't have all the answers yet. We don't have all the details, but it is a collaborative stakeholder-based process that gets us there. And that is what MECLA is all about. So Lucy, Ivana, Dijon, Caroline, Jackie, George, thank you. We're a do tank, and that's the doing. Thank you very much. Thanks to our audience for joining us online and contributing to the very engaging level of questions and discussion. A recording of today's presentation and discussions will be uploaded on the MECLA website. with a link to be sent out to all our registered attendees. Can I encourage you to have a look at our website? We have a growing body of resources there to bust myths, to inform conversation, to help inform the language. You can sign up to our newsletter while you're there. A big thank you to Monica Richter from WWF, to Katia Verheyen and Alexi Barnstone from Climate Kick Australia. Together, Monica, Katia, Alexi and me, we make up the MECLA Secretariat that make this possible. So thank you. I should also point out, for Where's MECLA Going, Monica and I are reaching out to many of the national stakeholders in this conversation. We'll be heading to Canberra shortly to further engage the Commonwealth Government. We've got several states very much committed and engaged, and many of the private sector. So that conversation continues to make this a national endeavour, a national collaboration. So thank you to the Secretariat. Our next spotlight, another exciting event. I don't know if you can top the measurement of carbon, but we'll have a go. This will be a focus on digital technologies to help us cut embodied carbon, and it also promises to be a fascinating session. Keep an eye out on our socials for the details. I love being able to say that. Keep an eye out on our socials for this next must-see spotlight. But for now, thank you, goodbye, and let's keep doing the do tank. Thanks, everybody. Lucy, great job. Thank you.